What if the most emotional moment of Prince Harry's life didn't happen on a battlefield or at a royal funeral, but behind closed palace doors, when a folder was quietly placed on a table and everything he thought he knew began to wobble? Sit with that for a second. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because the story you're about to hear is not about accusations carved in stone. It's about whispers that refuse to die, questions that were never meant to be asked out loud, and a monarchy that, for the first time in a long time, appears to be reacting rather than controlling the narrative. This is not a verdict. This is not a confirmation. This is the moment the silence cracked. And when silence cracks, it makes the loudest noise of all. The reports began the same way palace stories often do, quietly, almost politely. A briefing here, a carefully worded line there. No dramatic announcement. No flashing sirens. Just enough information to trigger something far more dangerous than outrage. Curiosity. Why now? Why this subject? Why would Buckingham Palace, an institution that has survived wars, abdications, scandals, and global humiliation, even allow questions about royal children to breathe? Because something changed. Behind the scenes, aides reportedly stopped deflecting and started preparing. Lawyers were consulted. Language was refined. And most chilling of all, sources claimed that the king himself requested a review of documentation that most people assumed had been sealed forever. Think about that. A father, a king, a man who waited more than 7 decades for the crown. What could possibly compel him to reopen a chapter involving his grandchildren? And here's where the emotional temperature rises. According to multiple accounts circulating in royal commentary circles, not official statements, not sworn testimony, but persistent insider chatter. The moment Harry and Meghan were informed that the palace was reassessing how certain records were being interpreted, the reaction was not defiance. It was devastation. Witnesses described tears, raised voices, a sense of panic that didn't match the calm, confident public image the couple had projected for years. Ask yourself this. If everything was straightforward, why the fear? For a long time, the public conversation around Archie and Lilibet was treated as untouchable. Even critics drew a line. Children were off limits. And yet, questions lingered in corners of the internet and among royal watchers who noticed inconsistencies but were quickly dismissed as conspiratorial or cruel. Timelines that didn't quite line up. Protocol deviations that were never fully explained. Unusual wording in official announcements. On their own, these details meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. But patterns are dangerous things, especially when they start to attract attention from inside the palace walls rather than outside them. What makes this moment different is not the rumors themselves. Rumors have always existed. What makes this moment explosive is the suggestion that the palace is no longer pretending those rumors don't exist. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Is the palace trying to reveal something or contain something? Let's be clear before we go any further. No credible public evidence has been released proving any alternative parentage. No court has ruled. No DNA results have been published. Anyone claiming certainty is lying to you. But uncertainty? Uncertainty is real. And uncertainty is powerful, especially when it involves the line of succession, especially when it involves titles, legitimacy, and the centuries-old rules that the monarchy claims to live by. Rules that were bent. Rules that were bypassed. Rules that, according to insiders, were quietly flagged and then quietly ignored. Until now. Here's the part that should make you pause. If this were purely about gossip, the palace would do what it always does. Ignore it. Starve it. Let it burn itself out. That strategy has worked for generations. So why didn't they do that this time? Why did legal teams reportedly review birth-related documentation again? Why did palace aides allegedly brief journalists off the record using language that was unusually careful, almost defensive? And why did King Charles, a man obsessed with legacy, suddenly decide that clarity mattered more than comfort? Some suggest this is about protecting the institution rather than punishing individuals. That the monarchy, weakened by years of scandal and public distrust, cannot afford another ambiguity, especially one that could be weaponized later. Others believe it's about timing, about control, about ensuring that if questions are ever answered, they are answered on palace terms, not forced out by leaks, lawsuits, or future memoirs. And then there's the most painful interpretation of all, that this is about a father who knows what it's like to live under a cloud of doubt, watching history repeat itself and deciding, too late, that honesty, however brutal, is better than silence. Now imagine being Harry in that moment. A man who walked away from royal life to protect his family. A man who has spent years insisting that the press lies, that narratives are manipulated, that truth is often buried. What happens when the institution he fled suddenly claims it is acting in the name of truth? What happens when the people he no longer trusts say they are only asking questions? And what happens when those questions involve his children? This is where the emotional stakes become unbearable. Because even if every rumor is false, even if every inconsistency has an innocent explanation, the mere act of revisiting them changes everything. It tells the world that doubt exists. It tells the media that the door is open. It tells Harry and Meghan that the protection they believed was permanent may have had conditions attached. And according to those close to the situation, that realization hit hard. Very hard. Some describe Meghan as furious. Others say she was inconsolable. Some insist Harry oscillated between rage and silence, retreating inward the way he has during previous crises. Which version is true? Maybe all of them. Because when identity is questioned, even hypothetically, it cuts deeper than scandal. It cuts into belonging. And that's the irony no one is talking about. Harry and Meghan built their public narrative on the idea of reclaiming control over their story, of refusing to let others define them, of breaking free from a system they claimed was toxic. But now, that same system appears to be holding the microphone again. Not shouting, not accusing, just asking. And questions, when left unanswered, have a way of growing teeth. Here's another detail that complicates everything. Sources suggest that whatever the palace reviewed was not new information. It wasn't a sudden discovery. It was material that had existed for years, quietly archived, unexamined, because no one wanted to open that box. So why open it now? Why risk the emotional damage? Why risk global backlash? Why risk being seen as cruel? Unless the risk of not acting had become greater. Unless someone, somewhere, was preparing to force the issue. Unless the palace feared that if they didn't move first, they would lose control entirely. And that brings us to the phrase that keeps appearing in discussions around this story. Identity. Not parentage. Not biology. Identity. In royal terms, those words are not interchangeable. Identity determines legitimacy. Legitimacy determines titles. Titles determine history. And history, once written, does not apologize. The palace knows this better than anyone. Which is why the most unsettling part of this story is not what has been said, but what hasn't. No denial. No emphatic rebuttal. No forceful "this is nonsense." Just careful language, legal precision, and silence where outrage would normally live. Ask yourself honestly, if this were baseless, wouldn't the response be louder? Or is the palace playing a longer game? One that involves revealing just enough to protect itself, while leaving the most painful truths locked away. Because if there is one thing the monarchy excels at, it's survival. Even when survival comes at a personal cost. As this story unfolds, remember this. Nothing here exists in isolation. Every choice connects to another. Every silence creates a shadow. And every shadow invites speculation. We are only at the beginning. Because the next question isn't about what the palace reviewed. It's about when they first noticed something was wrong. And once you understand when the first red flag appeared, the entire timeline starts to collapse. That's the question the palace never wanted anyone asking. Because once you trace the timeline backward, not from headlines, not from interviews, but from internal moments that never made the news, a very different story begins to take shape. A story not of sudden discovery, but of quiet awareness. Of something noticed, noted, and then deliberately set aside. Until it couldn't be anymore. This is the point where insiders say everything changed. Not when rumors surfaced online. Not when commentators speculated. But when the palace itself allegedly realized that certain questions were no longer staying outside the gates. And that moment, according to several royal observers with long-standing connections, didn't happen recently. It happened years ago. Think about that. If you're imagining a dramatic late-night revelation, wipe that image away. This wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow drip. A raised eyebrow in a meeting. A document reviewed twice instead of once. A phrase that didn't quite sit right, but wasn't challenged because challenging it would mean opening a door no one wanted to walk through. The monarchy is built on continuity, on stability, on the unspoken agreement that some things are simply accepted and moved past for the greater good. And for a long time, that instinct overrode discomfort. But discomfort doesn't disappear when ignored. It just waits. According to accounts circulating among palace-adjacent circles, the earliest unease reportedly surfaced around the way information was handled rather than what the information contained. Not content, but process. Who signed what? When certain confirmations were issued. Why some procedures were streamlined while others were bypassed entirely. On paper, everything looked acceptable, just unusual. And unusual is not illegal. Unusual is not scandal. Unusual, in royal life, is often explained away as modernization. But here's where contradiction creeps in. The same institution that prides itself on adapting traditions when convenient is also fiercely protective of protocol when lineage is involved, especially when children are connected, even indirectly, to succession, titles, and future legitimacy. So when processes around royal births appeared flexible, some aides reportedly took note, not because they suspected wrongdoing, but because flexibility itself was the anomaly. Ask yourself this. In an institution obsessed with optics and precedent, why take shortcuts at all? One former royal staffer, speaking anonymously in a private forum, put it this way. It wasn't that anyone thought something was wrong. It was that no one could explain why things were done differently. That's the kind of sentence that doesn't matter until it suddenly does. At the time, there were reasons. Privacy concerns, media pressure, security risks, all valid, all defensible, and most importantly, all convenient. So the questions were shelved. But shelving is not the same as erasing. As years passed, the family dynamic fractured. Harry and Meghan stepped back. The relationship between the Sussexes and the palace hardened. And with distance came something dangerous. Perspective. Without the emotional urgency of crisis management, without the instinct to protect unity at all costs, past decisions began to look unfinished. Incomplete. That's when a review allegedly began to take shape. Not as an investigation, not as an accusation, but as what insiders call a clarity exercise. That phrase alone should make you pause. Clarity from whose perspective? And clarity for what purpose? This wasn't about rewriting history. It was about understanding it before someone else did. Because by then, the palace was no longer the only one asking questions. Media outlets had noticed inconsistencies. Not enough to publish outright claims, but enough to keep files open. Lawyers were reportedly advising on hypothetical scenarios, not because they were imminent, but because they were possible. And possibility is the enemy of control. Now let's talk about timing. Why did this clarity exercise escalate into something more serious only recently? According to those tracking the situation, the answer lies with the king's ascension. When Charles became king, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited unresolved questions, files marked, dealt with, that had never truly been closed. Decisions made under different leadership, different pressures, different emotional landscapes. And Charles is not his mother. Queen Elizabeth valued containment above all else. Her strategy was endurance. Outlast the storm. Never explain. Never complain. Charles, by contrast, has always been described as introspective, even anxious, about how history will judge him. He doesn't just want the monarchy to survive. He wants it to make sense. That distinction matters. Because when questions about legitimacy, identity, or procedure exist, even hypothetically, they threaten not just individuals, but the coherence of the institution itself. And so, according to palace watchers, Charles asked for answers. Not accusations, not conclusions, just answers. What was done, why it was done, and whether it could withstand scrutiny if ever forced into the open. That request alone reportedly sent ripples through the system. Because once a king asks, "Explain this to me," silence is no longer an option. Here's where the emotional contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Harry has spent years accusing the palace of secrecy, manipulation, and narrative control, of hiding truths behind tradition, of sacrificing individuals for the sake of the crown. So what happens when the palace claims it is now seeking transparency? Is that accountability? Or is it hypocrisy? And more importantly, who decides? This is where sources say the conversation shifted from administrative to personal. Because clarity on paper is one thing. Clarity in public is another. If the palace were ever forced to address questions about identity, even indirectly, the consequences would be devastating. Not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the monarchy's moral authority. Imagine the headlines. Imagine the lawsuits. Imagine the irreversible damage. So why risk it? Unless the risk of silence had become even greater. There are whispers, and again, whispers, not confirmations, that legal challenges in unrelated matters began asking for documentation that touched on timelines and definitions. Nothing explicit, nothing sensational, just enough to make palace lawyers uneasy. Because in law, ambiguity is a liability. And the monarchy has learned, painfully, what happens when documents don't align with narratives. So the choice wasn't between revealing and hiding. It was between preparing and being blindsided. And that's when Harry and Meghan were reportedly informed. Not that anything was being accused, but that the palace was reviewing how certain records might be interpreted if ever questioned. Read that carefully. Not reviewing the records themselves. Reviewing interpretations. That distinction is everything, because it implies that the facts may not change, but their meaning might. And when you're told that something you assumed was settled is now being reinterpreted, the ground shifts beneath your feet. This is the moment witnesses describe as emotionally explosive, not because of what was said, but because of what was implied. If there was nothing to worry about, why the need for reinterpretation at all? If identity was beyond question, why the sudden legal sensitivity? Those are the questions that reportedly left Harry reeling. Friends describe him as furious. Not at the suggestion itself, but at the idea that the palace could even entertain it after everything that had already been lost. Others say he was eerily quiet, that familiar shutdown, the one that follows when anger gives way to exhaustion. Meghan's reaction, depending on who you believe, ranged from disbelief to outrage to despair. Again, not because of proof, but because of power. Because once the palace starts framing narratives, the people involved lose control. Even if they're innocent. And here's the cruel irony. The palace insists this was about protection, about ensuring that no future challenge could destabilize the monarchy. But from Harry and Meghan's perspective, protection felt a lot like suspicion. And suspicion, once introduced, never leaves cleanly. Ask yourself this. Can a relationship survive when trust is replaced by contingency planning? Because that's what this moment represented. Not judgment, not accusation, but contingency. What if questions arise? What if definitions are challenged? What if silence is no longer enough? Those what-ifs are now part of the official calculus. And once that happens, nothing feels safe anymore. What makes this chapter even more unsettling is the realization that no one planned for this to become public. This wasn't meant to leak. It wasn't meant to be discussed. It certainly wasn't meant to fuel global speculation. But stories like this don't stay contained. They seep. They find cracks. And once they do, the palace loses its greatest weapon, invisibility. Which brings us to the most dangerous truth of all. The palace may not have wanted to speak, but it may soon be forced to. Because once the first red flag is acknowledged internally, every previous decision is reevaluated through a harsher lens. And if one explanation fails under that lens, then the entire narrative collapses. What if the problem was never about who said what, but when? Because once you stop looking at statements and start lining up dates, something unsettling happens. The story doesn't explode. It doesn't scream. It quietly slips out of alignment. And when timelines stop lining up, institutions panic. This is where palace insiders say the discomfort turned into something harder to ignore. Not suspicion, not accusation, unease. A feeling that too many moments required explanation, and that explanations were being stretched thinner each time they were repeated. Let's start with a simple truth most people overlook. Royal timelines are normally airtight. Every appearance is logged. Every journey documented. Every announcement vetted, timestamped, archived. Not because the palace is obsessive, but because history demands it. When you represent continuity, you cannot afford ambiguity. Future generations rely on these records not just for gossip, but for legitimacy. So when gaps appear, they stand out. And according to those who've examined the public record closely, there were gaps. Nothing dramatic on their own. No smoking gun. Just moments that required the public to accept overlapping explanations without questioning them. Most people didn't notice. Why would they? They were distracted by the spectacle, the wedding, the drama, the fairy tale framing. But insiders notice everything. One of the earliest points of quiet discussion reportedly involved announcement timing. Not what was said, but how it was said, and how quickly. Normally, royal pregnancy announcements follow a predictable rhythm. Confirmation, controlled silence, carefully staged appearances, updates only when necessary. But in this case, the rhythm shifted. Announcements arrived sooner than expected. Details were simultaneously specific and vague. Language that usually adhered to precedent suddenly felt improvised. Again, not wrong, just different. Then there were public appearances. Photographs circulated. Footage was replayed. Analysts, not tabloids, but protocol specialists, noted how rapidly narratives moved from one stage to another. Ask yourself this. In an institution obsessed with managing expectation, why accelerate anything involving succession-adjacent children? Unless acceleration itself was the strategy. Because speed does something important. It discourages scrutiny. And scrutiny is what the palace fears most. Not because it hides truth, but because it cannot control how truth is interpreted once released. Here's where the contradiction deepens. At the same time that information flow felt accelerated, access became restricted. Medical details? Minimal. Professional confirmations? Unusually guarded. Traditional sign-offs? Absent or quietly adjusted. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, remember this. Privacy was the official explanation. And it made sense. Meghan was not born into royal life. She had different expectations, different boundaries. The palace adapted, or so it seemed. But adaptation always leaves fingerprints. And those fingerprints began to accumulate. Some staff reportedly noticed that explanations changed depending on the audience. What was said privately wasn't always phrased the same way publicly. Small shifts in wording. Emphasis moved. Context altered. Harmless? Possibly. But when layered over time, these shifts created friction. And friction creates heat. This is where timeline watchers, the quiet ones, the ones who don't post threads or chase clicks, began asking a dangerous question. What if the palace wasn't hiding information, but simplifying it? Because simplification is often the first step toward control. Instead of presenting complexity, you reduce the story to something digestible, something repeatable, something that discourages follow-ups. And for a while, it worked, until the family dynamic fractured. Once Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, the palace lost something crucial: proximity. Without proximity, narrative alignment becomes harder. Without daily coordination, statements take on independent lives. And without constant reinforcement, old questions resurface. Suddenly, journalists began re-examining timelines they'd previously accepted. Not aggressively, but curiously. Why did this announcement come before that appearance? Why was this protocol waived here, but enforced elsewhere? Why did language evolve over time? These weren't accusations. They were footnotes. And footnotes are dangerous because they live forever. What made things worse was the Sussexes' own storytelling. In interviews, documentaries, and books, Harry and Meghan spoke openly about their experiences. About feeling unsupported. About being left alone during critical moments. Emotionally powerful narratives. But narratives that sometimes collided with institutional records. Not in dramatic ways. Not in ways that could be easily highlighted in headlines. But in subtle contradictions. One timeline says one thing. Another memory suggests another. Which one is wrong? Memory is subjective. Records are rigid. And when the two diverge, institutions tend to trust paper. That's when palace aides reportedly began cross-referencing. Not to catch anyone out, but to understand what would happen if someone else did. Because in the modern world, nothing stays buried. Someone always files a request. Someone always asks a question in the wrong forum. Someone always decides to push. And once that happens, the palace must be ready. Here's a detail that rarely gets discussed. Royal documentation isn't just symbolic. It has legal implications. Titles, styles, placement in official records, all depend on precise definitions. If a definition is challenged, even hypothetically, lawyers get involved. And lawyers do not care about emotions. They care about consistency, which is why, According to legal insiders, one of the biggest concerns wasn't proving anything, but defending everything. Defending the timeline, defending the language used, defending the rationale behind deviations. Because if even one explanation failed under scrutiny, it could unravel more than just one story. Now imagine how that feels from Harry's perspective. A man who believes his family was targeted unfairly. A man who sees institutions as self-serving and cold. A man who has repeatedly framed his departure as an act of protection. To be told, even indirectly, that timelines are being re-examined would feel like betrayal. Not because it implies guilt, but because it implies doubt. And doubt, once introduced, is corrosive. Friends of the couple describe a growing sense of paranoia during this period. Not clinical paranoia, emotional paranoia. The feeling that every move was being watched, every statement dissected, every silence interpreted. Was that fear justified? Or was it the natural result of years spent in conflict with an institution that never forgets? Here's where the irony cuts deepest. The palace insists it was simply doing what it always does, preparing for contingencies. Ensuring that if questions arise, answers exist. But preparation looks very different depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. From the palace's view, this was prudence. From Harry and Meghan's view, it was surveillance. And that difference in perception may be the real rupture. Because once trust erodes, every action is reinterpreted through suspicion. A request for clarity becomes an accusation. A legal review becomes an attack. A timeline check becomes an interrogation. And yet, the palace couldn't stop. Because by this point, the timeline issue wasn't just internal anymore. External pressure was building. Journalists asking smarter questions. Legal professionals flagging vulnerabilities. Historians noting irregularities that future generations would question. The palace doesn't think in news cycles. It thinks in centuries. And from that vantage point, unanswered questions are unacceptable. Which brings us to the moment insiders say things shifted from review to response. A single question was reportedly raised in a briefing. What happens if this is challenged in court? Not by a journalist, not by a critic, by a third party with standing. That question changes everything. Because once litigation enters the equation, narratives collapse under oath. And oath demands precision. That's when the king's involvement reportedly intensified. Not because he believed something was wrong, but because he understood something was fragile. The timeline, the story, the trust. And once fragility is acknowledged, the next step is containment. Not revelation. Containment. Which leads us to a chilling realization. The palace may not be preparing to reveal truth. It may be preparing to survive it. Because survival sometimes means drawing lines, defining terms, clarifying language, and deciding, in advance, what will be said and what will never be spoken out loud. And if that's the case, then the most important part of this story hasn't happened yet. Because the real danger isn't what the timeline shows. It's who might force the palace to explain it. Why did Harry stop fighting back? That's the question that started echoing through royal circles once the timeline scrutiny began to leak beyond palace walls. Because if there's one thing the public has come to expect from Prince Harry, it's defiance. Anger, pushback, lawsuits, statements, interviews. A refusal to let narratives form without his voice challenging them. And yet, this time, something was different. There was no explosive rebuttal, no emergency interview, no furious legal threat issued within hours. Instead, there was silence. Not the polished, strategic silence of the palace, but a heavy, uncomfortable quiet that felt personal. Ask yourself honestly, when someone who has spent years shouting suddenly stops speaking, what does that usually mean? It doesn't always mean guilt. Sometimes it means shock. Sometimes it means exhaustion. Sometimes it means the ground has shifted in a way you didn't anticipate. According to people close to the situation, Harry's reaction to the palace's internal reassessment wasn't immediate rage. It was disbelief. The kind that leaves you staring at a wall, replaying conversations in your head, wondering when the narrative changed without you noticing. Because from Harry's perspective, he had already paid the price. He lost his role. His relationship with his family fractured. His reputation became a battlefield. His children were raised far from the institution he claimed had harmed him. So why, after all that, did it feel like the palace was still circling? That's where the emotional contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Harry has always framed his story as one of escape, of choosing love and protection over duty, of stepping away to shield his family from scrutiny. But now, scrutiny was finding him anyway. And this time, it wasn't coming from tabloids or trolls. It was coming from the very institution he accused of cruelty, quietly, methodically, legally. That hits differently. Friends describe Harry during this period as withdrawn. Not hiding exactly, but disengaged. He still appeared in public, still smiled, still spoke when required. But the fire was gone. Those who know him say that when Harry feels wronged, he usually reacts quickly and emotionally. He confronts. He accuses. He lashes out. Silence, for him, is not confidence. It's processing. And processing usually means something doesn't fit neatly into the story he's been telling himself. Here's where the timeline issue intersects with psychology. For years, Harry believed the palace manipulated narratives to protect itself at the expense of individuals. That belief fueled his departure. It justified the pain. It gave meaning to the loss. But when the palace frames its actions as procedural rather than punitive, that belief becomes harder to sustain. Because how do you fight a process? How do you accuse a review of cruelty? Especially when the review is framed as preventative, as something meant to protect the monarchy from future chaos rather than target a specific person. From the palace's side, the language was careful. This isn't about you. This isn't about accusations. This is about clarity. But clarity is a loaded word. Clarity implies something was unclear, and nothing undermines trust faster than the suggestion that a fundamental truth might be open to interpretation. People close to Harry say this was the moment he felt truly cornered. Not because he was being accused, but because he was being redefined. And redefinition is dangerous when you don't control the pen. Consider this. Harry has spent years telling his story through his own voice. Books, documentaries, interviews. Carefully curated narratives designed to reclaim agency. But legal reviews and institutional language don't care about voice. They care about definitions. They care about what words mean under pressure. And if those definitions ever conflict with personal narratives, institutions win. That realization, according to insiders, was devastating. Because it meant that even if Harry believed he was telling the truth, emotionally, experientially, the palace could still frame reality differently. And once that happens, public opinion becomes irrelevant. This may explain why Harry didn't rush to confront the rumors. Confronting them would require acknowledging them. Acknowledgement would legitimize questions. And once questions are legitimate, they cannot be controlled. So silence became the safest option. But silence has consequences too. It invites interpretation. It allows others to fill the void. And in the absence of denial, speculation grows teeth. Royal commentators began noting Harry's body language. His tone, his posture. They compared it to past crises. Something was off. This wasn't the angry prince of previous years. This wasn't the combative figure who challenged journalists head-on. This was someone conserving energy. Someone choosing not to escalate. Why? One explanation offered by those sympathetic to Harry is emotional fatigue. After years of public warfare, he simply didn't have the strength for another battle. That's possible. Another explanation is strategic restraint. Perhaps lawyers advise silence. Perhaps speaking would complicate matters legally. Also possible. But there's a third explanation that makes people deeply uncomfortable. That Harry didn't know how to respond. Because when the issue isn't a lie you can disprove, but a question you can't easily close, any response risks making things worse. Imagine being told that something you assumed was unquestionable is now being reviewed. Not publicly, but internally, by people with power. What do you say? Do you deny something no one has accused you of? Do you attack a process without confirming its existence? Do you defend your children against questions that haven't officially been asked? Every option is a trap. And Harry, for once, didn't rush into one. Meghan's response during this period, according to conflicting accounts, was more volatile. Some describe her as furious. Convinced that the palace was once again positioning itself to control the narrative at her expense. Others say she was emotionally shattered, interpreting the review as a personal betrayal after years of silence and distance. Both can be true. Anger and fear often coexist. What's clear is that the couple reportedly felt blindsided, not because the palace had doubts, but because those doubts were now being formalized. put into language, reviewed by lawyers, prepared for hypotheticals. That step transforms doubt into infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't disappear just because feelings are hurt. Here's another detail that adds complexity. Sources suggest that Harry attempted to seek reassurance, not through public channels, but privately. Quiet conversations, requests for clarity, attempts to understand what exactly was being questioned. The answers he received, according to insiders, were unsatisfying, not because they were evasive, but because they were conditional. Nothing is wrong, but we must be prepared. This is about the institution, not individuals. That kind of language doesn't comfort someone who already believes institutions cannot be trusted. It confirms their worst fears. And so Harry retreated further. No interviews. No explosive statements. No dramatic counteroffensive. Just distance. But distance has limits. Because silence doesn't stop processes already in motion. And the palace, once it begins preparing for contingencies, doesn't reverse course easily. Which brings us to the moment when silence stopped being an option. Not because Harry chose to speak, but because someone else might. There are whispers, again, whispers, not confirmations, that third parties began asking questions. Not journalists, not commentators, professionals, lawyers, historians, advisors with no emotional attachment to the Sussexes or the palace. Their interest wasn't scandal. It was risk. What happens if this ambiguity surfaces later, when the monarchy is even more fragile? What happens if someone forces definitions that were never meant to be tested? Those questions don't wait for emotional readiness. They demand answers. And once those questions exist, Harry's silence becomes part of the record. A silence that can be interpreted in ways he cannot control. Which may explain why those close to him say this period marked a turning point. Not a public one. A private one. A moment when Harry reportedly realized that walking away didn't end the story. It just changed who controlled it. And if that's true, then the next chapter becomes even more unsettling. Because while Harry was processing, the palace wasn't standing still. It was deciding what evidence could be shown, what language could be used, and what lines would never be crossed, even if the truth demanded it. And that decision would soon land like a bomb behind closed doors. Because the next thing to surface wasn't a question. It was a file. That's the question that froze the room when it was mentioned, not announced, not revealed, just referenced in careful, almost clinical language. A file. Singular. Definitive. Not a rumor. Not a theory. A physical or digital collection of records that, according to insiders, forced the palace to stop speaking in hypotheticals and start speaking in strategy. And no, before you jump there, this wasn't a dramatic dossier, stamped confidential, with red ink and shock value headlines waiting inside. It was worse than that. It was ordinary. Because ordinary documents are the most dangerous ones of all. This file, sources say, didn't accuse. It didn't speculate. It didn't tell a story. It simply gathered existing material, timelines, procedural notes, correspondence, and confirmations, and placed them side by side. And when they were viewed together, without narrative padding, without emotional framing, without public relations gloss, something uncomfortable emerged. Not proof of wrongdoing, but proof of inconsistency. And in an institution that survives on precision, inconsistency is a threat. Let's be clear about one thing before we go further. This file did not reveal true parents. It did not name alternatives. It did not declare scandal. Anyone claiming that is selling certainty they don't possess. What it did, according to those familiar with its contents, was highlight how identity is recorded, defined, and protected within royal systems, and where those systems had been adapted in ways that were never meant to be stress-tested. That distinction matters, because the palace wasn't panicking about biology. It was panicking about definitions. And definitions, once questioned, can be weaponized. The file reportedly included internal correspondence from multiple departments. Medical liaison notes, protocol advisories, legal clarifications, and communication strategy memos. Nothing explosive on its own, but together, they formed a map of decisions made quickly, a map of exceptions granted quietly, a map of explanations that evolved over time. And when that map was reviewed under one question, could this withstand hostile scrutiny? The answer wasn't reassuring. Here's where King Charles enters the story in a more personal way. According to palace watchers, This file was not dumped on his desk without context. It was walked through, explained carefully, framed as a risk assessment rather than a revelation. This is important. Charles was not presented with a scandal. He was presented with a vulnerability that didn't exist when his mother was alive, because her authority alone smoothed over ambiguity. But authority fades. Records remain. As king, Charles doesn't have the luxury of unexamined assumptions. He is acutely aware that his reign will be measured not just by tradition, but by transparency, whether he wants that standard or not. So when he reportedly reviewed this file, the question wasn't, is something wrong? It was, what happens if someone else reads this without context? And that's when the temperature dropped. Because context is everything, until it isn't. Once documents leave controlled environments, they speak for themselves. They don't explain intention. They don't convey emotional nuance. They don't care about family dynamics. They just exist. And existence is enough. This is why the palace's response shifted from quiet review to strategic containment. Not containment of truth, containment of interpretation. According to insiders, discussions turned toward language almost immediately. How certain phrases had been used historically. How identity had been defined in official communications. Whether wording could be clarified without drawing attention. But here's the catch. Clarification requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement invites questions. So the palace faced an impossible balancing act. Say nothing and risk future exposure under worse circumstances. Say something and validate speculation they had worked for years to suppress. This is where Harry and Meghan reportedly re-entered the conversation, not as subjects, but as variables. They were informed, according to accounts, that the palace was considering how to protect all parties if questions arose publicly. That framing was deliberate, protective, neutral. But neutrality can feel like judgment when you're already wounded. Harry, sources say, reacted with a mix of disbelief and fury. Not because of what the file contained. He was not shown everything. But because of what the existence of the file implied. That at some point, someone decided this needed to be compiled. That trust was no longer assumed. That even the most personal aspects of his life were now being evaluated through institutional lenses. Meghan's response, again depending on who you listen to, was more immediate and emotional. Some say she demanded to know who authorized the review. Others claim she felt targeted, convinced that the palace was laying groundwork to undermine her credibility yet again. What everyone agrees on is this. The word file changed everything. Because files don't exist for comfort. They exist for action. And that action doesn't have to be public to be powerful. Here's another uncomfortable layer. The palace didn't create this file to attack the Sussexes. They created it to defend themselves. Defend against future lawsuits. Defend against hostile media inquiries. Defend against historical scrutiny decades from now. In other words, this wasn't about now. It was about later. And that future-oriented thinking is what made the situation so volatile. Because from Harry and Meghan's perspective, the palace was planning for a world in which their family narrative might be challenged. With or without their consent. And once planning begins, trust is already broken. Ask yourself this. If you truly believe something is unquestionable, do you prepare a defense for it? Or do you only prepare defenses when you fear questions you can't fully control? That's the question that reportedly haunted Harry. Because no one could tell him what the palace would do if pressure mounted. Only what they were prepared for. And preparation is not reassurance. As these internal discussions continued, another shift occurred. One that most people outside royal circles didn't notice. The media tone changed. Not overtly, not dramatically, but subtly. Stories became more careful, language more conditional. Phrases like, according to protocol, and as recorded, began appearing more frequently in royal reporting. Why does that matter? Because journalists often mirror the language fed to them in briefings. And someone, somewhere, was clearly choosing words very carefully. This wasn't a smear campaign. It was groundwork. And groundwork always precedes movement. Now let's talk about the phrase that triggered the most panic behind closed doors. Identity review. Not investigation. Not audit. Review. A review sounds harmless. Administrative. Routine. But in royal terms, identity is sacred. Identity defines lineage. Lineage defines legitimacy. Legitimacy defines the monarchy's moral authority. So even the idea of an identity review, no matter how procedural, carries explosive implications. And that's why the palace never used those words publicly. They couldn't. Because once identity is framed as reviewable, it becomes conditional. And conditional identity undermines everything. This is also why, according to insiders, the palace drew a hard line. There would be no public challenge to the children's status. No declarations. No denials. No clarifications that could be misinterpreted. Instead, the strategy was to quietly adjust internal language and prepare responses for hypothetical scenarios, without ever confirming those scenarios existed. From an institutional standpoint, this was the safest path. From a human standpoint, it was devastating. Because Harry and Meghan were left in limbo. Not accused, not exonerated, just accounted for. And being accounted for by an institution you no longer trust feels like being trapped in someone else's spreadsheet. Every variable assessed, every risk calculated, your feelings irrelevant. This is the moment sources say Harry truly understood something he had avoided acknowledging. That leaving the royal family didn't free him from it. It simply changed his role within it, from participant to risk factor. And that realization broke something. Friends say Harry became obsessed with one question during this period. What happens if this leaks? Because leaks are inevitable. Not if, when. And if the existence of the file became public, the narrative would run without him. Speculation would explode. Headlines would sharpen. And silence would be interpreted as confirmation. That's the nightmare scenario. And the palace knew it too. Which is why they began preparing statements they hoped would never be used. Carefully worded. Legally precise. Emotionally empty. Statements designed not to explain, but to withstand. And that's the most chilling part of this chapter. The palace wasn't trying to tell the truth. It was trying to survive it. And once survival becomes the priority, relationships become collateral. Because the next step wasn't about documents or timelines. It was about deciding what the palace would say if forced, and what it would never say, no matter the cost. And that decision would place Harry and Meghan on the opposite side of the institution in a way they hadn't anticipated. Because once lines are drawn quietly, crossing them becomes impossible. And the next move wouldn't be made by Harry, or Meghan, or even the king. It would be made by pressure. What happens when pressure stops being theoretical? Because up until this point, everything you've heard exists in the realm the palace prefers most: preparation, contingencies, internal language, quiet reviews that never see daylight. But pressure doesn't stay abstract forever. Pressure looks for exits. And according to multiple accounts, the moment pressure began to feel real was not when journalists speculated or when commentators asked sharper questions. It was when the palace was told, in no uncertain terms, that silence might not hold. This is the point where the story stops being about documents and starts being about fear. Not fear of scandal. Fear of loss of control. Here's what most people don't understand about the monarchy. It is not designed to react. It is designed to endure. Every instinct within it is calibrated toward minimizing volatility. That's why statements are delayed. Why apologies are rare. Why silence is weaponized. But endurance fails when timelines accelerate. And suddenly, they were. According to palace-adjacent sources, a series of external developments, none of them dramatic on their own, began converging. Legal inquiries brushing up against royal definitions. Journalists requesting clarifications they had never requested before. Advisors flagging language that might not withstand adversarial interpretation. No one was accusing, but everyone was preparing. And preparation is contagious. Once one department prepares, others follow. Once lawyers ask questions, communicators get nervous. Once communicators get nervous, leadership gets involved. That's when the king was briefed again. Not with new information, with a new risk assessment. And that assessment reportedly carried a warning that changed the tone of the room. If this is forced into the open, we won't control how it's framed. That sentence matters. Because the palace doesn't fear truth as much as it fears misinterpretation. It fears headlines that simplify complexity into scandal. It fears narratives that ignore nuance and run straight to outrage. And when the subject involves children, especially children tied to succession, outrage spreads faster than reason. This is where the palace began considering a move it hates more than almost anything else. Preemption, not revelation. Preemption, the idea that if something is going to surface, it is better to shape the perimeter of the conversation before it explodes. But how do you preempt a question you can't ask out loud? That's the dilemma that reportedly kept senior aides awake. Because any statement about identity, lineage, or protocol, even one meant to reassure, would legitimize speculation. Say nothing and risk being accused of hiding. Say something and invite interrogation. There was no winning option. And in situations like that, institutions default to the coldest calculation available: damage control. Not moral clarity. Damage control. This is where Harry and Meghan's position became even more precarious. They were no longer just family members. They were variables in a crisis simulation. If pressure mounts, how will they respond? If asked directly, will they deny? If silent, will that silence be read as confirmation? If angry, will that escalate scrutiny? Those questions weren't personal. They were strategic. And that distinction is what reportedly devastated Harry most. Because strategy doesn't care about feelings. It cares about outcomes. Friends say Harry felt stripped of agency during this period. Not publicly humiliated, privately sidelined. Conversations happening around him rather than with him. Decisions being modeled without his input. The very thing he accused the palace of for years was happening again. Only now, he was outside the room. Meghan, according to those familiar with her state of mind at the time, perceived this as confirmation of her worst fears. That no matter how far they moved, no matter how loudly they told their story, the institution would always reserve the right to redefine it. And that belief hardened into anger. Anger at being analyzed instead of trusted. Anger at being framed as risk instead of family. Anger at an institution that claimed neutrality while quietly preparing defenses. Here's where the contradiction becomes brutal. The palace insisted it was acting to protect everyone involved. But protection without consent feels like control. And control, especially after years of conflict, feels like threat. This is when talk of lines began surfacing in private discussions. Lines that would not be crossed publicly. Lines that would never be acknowledged. Lines designed to protect the monarchy even if individuals felt sacrificed. One such line, according to insiders, involved never publicly questioning the children's status, even if privately, definitions were being refined. Another involved never confirming or denying rumors directly, no matter how loud they became. And perhaps the most painful line of all, never allowing Harry and Meghan to dictate the terms of clarification. That last one matters. Because for Harry, control over narrative wasn't about winning. It was about dignity. About ensuring that his children were not discussed as abstractions or hypotheticals. But institutions don't negotiate dignity. They calculate exposure. As pressure continued to mount, a new fear emerged within palace walls, one that had nothing to do with the Sussexes. What if this becomes political? The monarchy exists by consent. Public trust is its oxygen. And in an era already hostile to inherited power, any suggestion of opacity around succession-adjacent issues becomes ammunition. Advisors reportedly warned that even unfounded rumors could be weaponized by critics of the monarchy itself. Not against Harry, not against Meghan, against the crown. That reframed everything. This was no longer a family matter. It was existential. And when survival enters the equation, empathy often exits. This is when contingency statements became more formal. Drafts refined. Legal review intensified. Every word tested against worst-case interpretations. Not to release. To have. Just in case. Those close to the process describe an atmosphere that was tense, grim, and deeply uncomfortable. No one wanted to be in this position. No one wanted to be associated with a narrative involving children in doubt. But the machine doesn't stop once it starts. And the more the palace prepared, the more isolated Harry and Meghan became. Not because they were excluded deliberately, but because inclusion would have required vulnerability the institution could not afford. Imagine being told, implicitly, that your life is being modeled as a scenario, that your children's identities are being discussed not emotionally, but hypothetically, that your silence is being assessed for risk, that your reactions are being predicted. That's not betrayal in the dramatic sense. It's colder than that. It's erasure. And according to those close to Harry, this was the moment his grief turned into something else. Not rage. Resignation. A quiet understanding that this story might move forward with or without him. Which brings us to the most dangerous realization of all. The palace may not be planning to speak, but it is preparing for the moment it has no choice. Because once external pressure crosses a certain threshold, silence stops being protective and starts being suspicious. And when that happens, the question won't be whether the palace will say something. It will be what it chooses to say and what it chooses to leave out. Because omissions can be just as powerful as revelations. And if the palace is forced to clarify definitions without explaining decisions, the public will fill in the blanks themselves. That's the nightmare scenario everyone is trying to avoid. But nightmares have a way of arriving anyway, especially when too many people know something exists, even if they don't know what it is. Because the next phase of this story isn't about preparation. It's about exposure. Not because the palace wants it, but because pressure rarely asks permission. And once the first crack becomes visible, the dam doesn't fail all at once. It leaks. What happens when a leak doesn't announce itself? Because the most dangerous leaks don't arrive with headlines. They arrive as whispers, as oddly specific questions, as reporters suddenly using the same careful phrasing, as if coached by an invisible hand. That's when the palace knew the pressure had crossed a line. Not because anything had been published, but because too many people were circling the same silence. According to those watching closely, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Journalists who had once avoided the topic altogether began asking for context, not confirmation, not denial, context. Requests that referenced protocol, definitions, and historical precedent rather than rumor. That's how institutions recognize danger. When the questions stop sounding sensational and start sounding legal. This is the moment insiders say the palace understood something critical. The existence of preparation had become the story. Not the content, not the conclusions, the preparation itself. Because when an institution prepares extensively for a scenario it insists will never happen, people start asking why. And once that question takes hold, it doesn't matter how careful the answers are. The implication does the damage. Here's where timing becomes everything. Around this period, multiple royal correspondents reportedly received background briefings that seemed routine on the surface. Reminders of how royal documentation works, explanations of terminology, gentle nudges toward institutional definitions. Nothing scandalous, but unusual. Why remind journalists of procedures they already know? Unless you're trying to shape how they interpret something before it breaks. This is how narrative management actually works. Not by lying, by framing. You don't deny rumors. You redefine the language around them. Identity becomes status. Questions become misunderstandings. Reviews become standard practice. And if you do it early enough, you can blunt the impact. But framing has limits. Because once people sense framing, they push back harder. And that's when the palace faced its most uncomfortable truth yet. They might not be able to stop this from becoming public. Not because someone wanted revenge, but because too many professionals now knew too much to ignore. Legal advisors had discussed hypotheticals. Journalists had flagged anomalies. Historians had noted deviations. None of these groups act out of emotion. They act out of obligation. And obligation doesn't respect palace walls. This is where the king's role became central in a way few anticipated. According to palace observers, Charles was deeply reluctant to escalate anything publicly. His instinct was still containment, still patience, still hoping the storm would pass if starved of oxygen. But advisors reportedly warned him of a paradox. Silence no longer looked neutral. It looked calculated, and calculation invites suspicion. The king was faced with an impossible choice. Speak and legitimize speculation. Stay silent and confirm it in the public imagination. Neither option protected his family fully. Neither option protected the monarchy completely. This is where the idea of selective clarity emerged. Not full disclosure, not denial. Selective clarity. The concept was simple, if ethically fraught. If forced to respond, the palace would clarify processes without addressing outcomes. Explain how things work without discussing what those processes produced. In theory, this would reassure the public while avoiding personal harm. In practice, it risked sounding evasive. And evasion, once detected, becomes fuel. Harry and Meghan were reportedly briefed on this approach in vague terms. Not with drafts, not with specifics, but with reassurances. This is about the institution. This won't question your children. This is precautionary. Those reassurances, according to people close to them, rang hollow. Because precaution doesn't feel protective when you're the one being protected from. Harry, sources say, asked a question that cut to the heart of the matter. What happens if someone forces you to be specific? There was no good answer. Because specificity is exactly what the palace was trying to avoid. This is the moment some say Harry realized that the palace's priorities hadn't changed, only the language had. It would still protect itself first, even if that meant leaving him exposed to interpretation. That realization reportedly hardened his resolve to remain silent publicly, not out of strategy, out of distrust. If he couldn't control the narrative, he wouldn't participate in it. Meghan, meanwhile, is described by those around her as oscillating between anger and calculation, considering responses, weighing options, debating whether preemptive storytelling could blunt institutional framing. But here's the trap they faced. If they spoke first, they would elevate rumors into legitimacy. If they waited, they risked being defined by someone else. Every move carried risk. And that's when a new development allegedly entered the picture, one that shifted the balance yet again. A third party, not a journalist, not a royal aide, someone with no emotional investment in either side, someone whose interest was purely professional. According to whispers, this party asked a question that forced the palace to confront a scenario it had hoped would remain theoretical. What if this isn't a media issue? What if it becomes a legal one? That question landed like ice. Because legal challenges don't care about tradition. They care about clarity, documentation, and definitions that can be tested under oath. And once something is tested under oath, institutional ambiguity collapses. This is when the palace reportedly accelerated its preparations. Not because it wanted to speak, but because it feared being forced to. Drafts were refined again. Language tightened. Contingency responses categorized by scenario. Not published. Filed. Just in case. This is also when sources say the emotional toll on Harry and Meghan became impossible to ignore. Friends describe sleepless nights. Arguments fueled by fear rather than anger. A sense that their children were becoming symbols in a story they never asked to be part of. And that's the cruelest irony of all. The palace insists this is about protecting children from future harm. Harry and Meghan feel their children are already being harmed by the very act of preparation. Both sides believe they're acting responsibly. Both sides feel threatened. And in that collision, trust is the first casualty. As the weeks passed, something else happened, something subtle, but telling. Certain palace figures stopped denying rumors privately, not confirming them, but no longer dismissing them outright. Instead, they emphasized uncertainty. Language like interpretation, complexity, and historical context began appearing in conversations where firm denials once lived. That shift didn't go unnoticed, because uncertainty, when introduced by authority, becomes permission. Permission for speculation, permission for debate, permission for doubt, and doubt spreads faster than truth ever could. This is when royal commentators began asking a question they had avoided for years. Why hasn't the palace simply shut this down? Not with spin, with force, with clarity, with the kind of unequivocal language it has used in other crises. The absence of that force became its own answer. Or at least, that's how it was read. Whether fair or not, perception hardened. And perception, once set, is almost impossible to reverse. Behind closed doors, advisors reportedly warned that the longer the palace waited, the less control it would have when, not if, the story broke wider. But breaking wider didn't mean a single explosive revelation. It meant something more insidious. A slow drip of partial information. A patchwork of interpretations. A narrative assembled by outsiders. That's the scenario the palace fears most. Because you can't correct a story that doesn't have a single source. You can only react to it. And reacting is weakness. So the palace faced a final, brutal calculation. Say something limited now, and risk backlash. Or say nothing, and risk losing the narrative entirely. According to those close to the process, the decision was made reluctantly. If forced, the palace would speak. But only in the narrowest terms possible. No accusations. No confirmations. No emotional language. Just process. Just definitions. Just enough to draw a boundary. And that's when Harry and Meghan reportedly broke down. Not publicly, privately. Because